Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you, that means over 500 people to be precise, to this interview with Nancy Fraser conducted by Armin Thurnherr, entitled The COVID Pandemic, a Perfect Storm of Capitalist Irrationality. My name is Carsten Schneider, and I'm Professor of Political Science at Central European University. And I welcome you on behalf of my department and CEU as a whole. Nancy Fraser does not need much of an introduction, especially not in a setting like this, but she will nevertheless get a proper one from Armin Thurnherr in a second. Just briefly, Nancy Fraser is Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research in New York City and a world celebrity in several academic fields, not just one. Armin Thurnherr is one of the best known and best Austrian journalists and publicists. Among many achievements, he also is co-founder and publisher of the Viennese city newspaper Falter. We are very glad that Mr. Thurnherr will lead us through this event tonight. This public interview today forms part of the Viennese Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship. The Vienna Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship is a cooperation project of the University of Vienna, Vienna University of Economics and Business, Central European University in Vienna, the International Karl Polanyi Society based in Vienna, the Volkshochschule Wien, and it is supported financially by the Vienna Chamber of Labor and the city of Vienna. So our plan is that each year 2 world-renowned scholars are invited to fill this visiting professorship, and Nancy Fraser is the inaugural visiting professor. I'm sure you agree that it is difficult to imagine a better, more prestigious and fitting choice. During her tenure as visiting professor, Nancy Fraser has been involved in several activities. Many of them have the goal to involve a broad, also non-academic audience, and that is fully in the spirit of Karl Polanyi. On Tuesday and Wednesday, Nancy Fraser gave 2 incredibly captivating public lectures, and I'm sure many of you have attended those lectures. In addition, though, Nancy Fraser has co-taught with Andreas Novi a seminar for Vienna-based PhD students. And we have just finished, some minutes ago, a very stimulating workshop here, whatever this means in our digital times, at CEU on Nancy Fraser's forthcoming book. The interview today is the last in a series of these events and concludes the visiting professorship. And before we start, please allow me 2 or 3 remarks on the procedure of this interview. During the interview today, we try to include some questions from you, the audience. In Zoom, please use the Q&A box for this. The chat function is disabled. Needless to say, the more concise the question, the easier for us here in the background it is to monitor those questions and to bundle them, because sometime in the middle of the interview, I will briefly join a conversation between Nancy Fraser and Armin Thurnherr and present some of your questions. So let me conclude this welcome words with a word of thanks. I would like to express my gratitude and the gratitude of CEU to our colleagues from the Vienna institutions with whom we jointly work on the Vienna Karl Polanyi Visiting Professorship. I thank them for having reached out to CEU and to make us part of this exciting and timely initiative. As many of you know, CEU has been through difficult and turbulent years. The trauma of having been expelled from Hungary will probably take many years to heal. And for some of my colleagues, I fear it will never heal completely. But feeling welcomed here in Vienna and being included in this rich intellectual and academic life in Vienna, in Austria and beyond is, I feel, the best therapy. So thank you once again. And now over to Nancy Fraser and Armin Thurnherr.
Well, thank you very much, Carsten Schneider, for this kind introduction. And may I say that I feel very honored to be here to do this interview with Nancy Fraser, whom I have read and admired for many years. And I would like to introduce, as Carsten said, a little bit more her person. She is one of the best known, most celebrated American philosophers of the present. She's a feminist, a critical theorist, and professor of political and social science, and professor of philosophy at the New School, at the famous New School in New York City. And she is known for her critique of identity politics and her philosophical work on the concept of justice. And she is also a critic of contemporary liberal feminism and its abandonment of social justice issues. She's also president of the American Philosophical Association, Eastern Division, and she has published many books and many more essays, among them Fortunes of Feminism. And currently, as was mentioned, she's working on a new book that will come out in the beginning of 2022 and has the title of Cannibal Capitalism. And today, we will talk about a chapter in this book. I think it's the last chapter in this book mainly. This concerns her insights about the corona pandemic and is very precise and fascinating. Before we will do that, I would like to ask a few questions about her personal history and about her intellectual history. And I will also, of course, take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the situation in the USA, the current situation in the USA, and connected with all these questions are always questions of hegemony and how to win or lose this fight. So I'm very happy to be able to ask questions. And the first question I would like to ask you: how does an American political philosopher become a socialist? Because obviously you're a member of the 68 generation, but not many of that generation became socialists. How did it happen with you?
That's a great opening question, Armin. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I thank you for agreeing to conduct this interview. And I thank Karsten and the CEU and all the other sponsoring institutions. So you already sort of hit a good part of the answer. It has everything to do with my history in the New Left. But there were some things even earlier that I think, as I look back on my life, may have prepared the way. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, during a period in which it was a legally segregated city, Jim Crow racial segregation. And this was sort of normal to me as a young child, although I had several experiences in which things jarred and I knew something was wrong. But with the eruption of the civil rights movement, the desegregation struggle, that suddenly caused me to reinterpret my whole childhood, my whole family situation, and so on. And I think I did a sort of a typical teenage thing of kind of being very angry at my parents, who, were Franklin Roosevelt liberals. They weren't communists or socialists, but they talked a good line about equality and so on. And yet I felt as a rebellious teenager, they didn't really live what they preached. We moved from one neighborhood that was being racially integrated into another whiter neighborhood and so on. These are very typical American stories. Anyway, I sort of marshaled all this anger that I might have already had as a rebellious teenager into the political sphere. And then I followed the traditional itinerary of civil rights struggle, anti-Vietnam War struggle, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, feminism, and so on. This was a familiar thing. But I'll tell you one little anecdote that explains the sort of socialist piece of it, or really the Marxist piece of it, I would say. And I was very involved in the draft resistance movement to the Vietnam War, when young American men who are being drafted were being encouraged to burn their draft cards and to refuse to enter the army. And during this period, I was very captivated by the visual and news reports about Buddhist monks in Vietnam who were immolating themselves, burning themselves alive to protest the war. You remember these horrible scenes of people pouring gasoline and striking a match. So I was, just to tell you sort of how strange this period was, how crazy this time was. I was a young college student, and I was literally walking around saying to myself, if you're really against the war, how can you justify not burning yourself up? Fortunately, I met some Trotskyists about a week later, and they said, look, there's another way to fight this. And I think that was really how I became a socialist. And I was always part of the socialist wing of SDS, of Students from a Democratic Society. Later, I found that my original idea that there might be a socialist revolution within a short number of years in the United States was an illusion. I thought, okay, I need a longer term life plan. I went to graduate school, I got my PhD, but ever since, as a professor and so on, I feel like the values and the spirit of the New Left remain very vital for me. I feel like my basic moral intuitions and political commitments have not really changed. I hope I've become more sophisticated, and I think I know a lot more about what it means to develop those intuitions and perspectives. But 68 remains crucial for me.
What are your important teachers and academic influences? Because I remember I happened to be in the USA at that time too, so I know a little bit about the atmosphere and the times, and the SDS was anti-traditional, for example, mostly. So the socialist wing was the smaller part of it, I think. But what were your influences? Frankfurt School, or since you teach at the New School, I remember Hannah Arendt was still teaching there at that time. Did you get in touch with her, or what was decisive for you?
Yes, well, so I studied first at Bryn Mawr College, which is an elite women's college, and I went there to do classics. I mean, I've always had these two drives, the sort of political radical...
Excuse me, classics. Philological classic?
Yes, Greek and Latin. It was a center of classical Greek. My teacher was Richmond Lattimore, the great poet and translator of the Iliad. And I went there specifically to study with him. So I've always had these two poles in my life, the sort of political activist pull and a kind of more classic intellectual pool. And I chose this college to do classics. And then I switched quickly to philosophy, which captivated me, while still using the linguistic knowledge I was accumulating. But as the 60s unfolded, I more and more began to feel that the classical education I was getting was not suited to the moment. My activist self kind of took over. And I really struggled with these two passions that I had, how to put them together. An important teacher who helped me with that, who is now my colleague at the New School, was Richard J. Bernstein, who introduced me to the Frankfurt School. And above all, the first book that I read from this tradition was Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, Herbert Marcuse, which really articulated so well my own feeling of being in a society in which the sort of conventional tropes for understanding the world were more of a mystification than an actual clarification. And
alienation was the big word, right?
Alienation, for sure. And this idea of a one-dimensional society in which the institutions of power and the dominant discourses through a veil of mystification. And we New Leftists very much had the experience of trying to pierce through that veil, to say the unsayable, to speak truth to power. Since then, I've realized that Marcuse's description of a one-dimensional society was exaggerated, that actually there were plenty of sources of opposition and protest within the society, because I now believe that capitalism is a complex and contested social form, not a one-dimensional one. But that introduced me to the Frankfurt School. I was out of school between my original university where I did my bachelor's work. I took a 5-year gap at doing political work before I returned to do my graduate study. I entered graduate school at the City University of New York to get my PhD in philosophy. I was in a department that was relatively conventional in the American analytic tradition, analytic philosophy. This was not a good fit for me. I struggled to find teachers there and managed to find a few. But I think I really brought with me my New Left intellectual formation, and that was the main resource that I was drawing on, even in graduate school. I came to the New School for Social Research much, much later, long after Hannah Arendt had left, had died even. I taught for many years at Northwestern University on the outskirts of Chicago, and didn't go to the New School until 1995. It's still a long time, 25 years since I've been there, but that was not my first foray into academia. In the United States, Northwestern was a very fine private university with a very good faculty and student body, but it was a much more conventional university. I would say the atmosphere was more professional than deeply intellectual. And so when I had a chance to get a position at the New School, I jumped at it because I knew that this was really more my kind of a place, and I've never regretted that move.
Okay. Polanyi, how did he come into your biography? Was it later, and why did you find him interesting? Did you find him interesting as a historian, or as a counterpart maybe to Hayek, for whose ideology has become so dominant, although most people don't even know it exists, right. or they adhere to it more correctly? How did he come into your thinking?
So I had an initial encounter with Polanyi during my student years at Bryn Mawr. I read The Great Transformation then for a political theory, political science course, but he didn't.
Excuse me, that's interesting. May I ask, because Polanyi has been rediscovered here just lately, it seems just a few years ago in Europe, even in Austria, although he's originally Austrian. But in America, he was part of the program.
So I agree that now in the US, there's a major Polanyi revival going on, and many people are encountering him for the first time. But I don't know if it was just a quirk of my professor at my college. I was assigned to read him. I did. And at that point, he did not make a great impression on me, because by then, but the person was not Hayek for me, it was Marx. I was already becoming a Marxist at the time that I first read Polanyi. And like all young, passionate people encountering Marx for the first time, that kind of took me over. And I didn't have much bandwidth, let's say, to really appreciate Polanyi. It wasn't until many years later, when I reread Polanyi, that I realized what an amazing thinker this is, what a great treasure that book is. And I started teaching him. I was already offering seminars on the problem of capitalism and its critique. And so, of course, I was reading Max Weber, The Spirit of Capitalism and the Protestant Ethic. I was reading Marx. And then I said, okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to assign my students to read Polanyi, because this is another great critique of capitalism. So in the process of rereading and now teaching him, as I say, he made a huge impression on me. And I began to think of my whole worldview as involving what I still call now the two Karls, Marx and Polanyi, each of which have tremendous insights and each of which also have some blind spots. And my project became how to integrate the insights of these two Karls into a single, more comprehensive framework that might overcome the blind spots, except that I would now say that it's not just the two Karls, but I call it the two Karls plus, because the plus are things like feminist theory, ecological theory, anti-colonial and anti-imperial theory that are not adequately developed in either of those two.
Okay, you may be a plus too in a way, if I may say that. But since you mentioned feminists, you became very famous for your critique of contemporary feminists, because you criticized them for being part of neoliberalism or for accepting neoliberal traits without knowing it. How do you judge your critique and the effects now on feminism? Did you have any effect, or because judging from here, neoliberal feminism hasn't really become much weaker? Or is that a wrong impression?
So, I mean, I think it's a somewhat complicated story. I mean, first of all, just for the benefit of the audience, I would say that my idea was that in the transition from social democratic capitalism to neoliberal capitalism, I think that the dominant currents of feminism played an important role. In the United States, neoliberalism was introduced not by the right wing, even though Ronald Reagan had, sort of already embodied these ideas, and Milton Friedman and so on and so forth, but it was really the centrist wing of the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton and later Barack Obama, who actually consolidated the neoliberal policy regime. And I think they were looking for a strategy, the new Democrats, how to win elections from Republicans. And they hit on this formula of promulgating a kind of apparently pro-feminist, pro-civil rights, pro-gay and lesbian, all the progressive social movements, that was going to be a sort of what I would call a politics of recognition strategy that was joined to this political economy of neoliberalization and financialization. And so I thought that a certain form of feminism, the dominant form of feminism, had been, let's say, used and allowed itself to be used, frankly, as a kind of legitimation for neoliberalization. And it's a feminism that is not genuinely egalitarian. It is rather liberal meritocratic, meaning it aims at allowing the talented, what Du Bois called the talented tenth of the Black population, the talented tenth of the female population, to sort of rise to the top of the corporate hierarchy, of the military hierarchy, of the system of political office, and so on, by dismantling discriminatory barriers, but without making any basic structural changes, and therefore really didn't do a lot for the overwhelming majority of women. And you could make the same critique about the dominant wing of the civil rights movement, the anti-Black racist movement. It, benefits the talented tenth much more than it benefits the overwhelming majority of people of color. So that was the critique I was developing. I said that there had been a kind of unholy alliance, let's say, between liberal feminism and neoliberalism. The critique that I developed had got some real reception within the academic and intellectual world. It was not as controversial as I expected. I thought there would be a lot more pushback and a lot more people defending feminism and objecting. But I think that the ideas that I was articulating there was already a lot of unease about what was happening to feminism. So they met a receptive audience. Other people had come to a similar perspective on their own, and I gave a voice to something that was in the air, I would say. Now, that doesn't mean that the sort of mainstream of feminism in the Democratic Party and elsewhere was affected. But something important did happen in 2016 when Donald Trump surprised us all by defeating Hillary Clinton, who was the very embodiment of the feminism that I was criticizing. And I think Hillary Clinton's loss represented a kind of crisis for liberal feminism. It really showed that there was such cynicism about her. And I don't mean only on the part of Trump and Trump supporters. She very much represented politics as usual, the sort of power center of the Democratic Party, which many people felt had very unfairly intervened on her behalf against Bernie Sanders. I was a strong Sanders supporter. And so, the liberal feminism had lost its glow. And after that, the kind of critique that I was developing then began to get a wider audience. And I think that today, maybe this is more true in Southern Europe and in Latin America, where there have been these big feminist, let's say anti-capitalist demonstrations, where feminism has become the face of anti-austerity, of anti-neoliberalism. And this is not liberal feminism. This is a different feminism. So I think today I would say there's a sort of struggle going on for the soul of feminism. The power elite, the so-called femocrats, are still, have their fingers on the balance of power. But there is a widespread hunger for a different path. I tried to articulate one version of that different path in a little book that I co-authored with Cinzia Aruzza and Tithi Bhattacharya called Feminism for the 99%, a Manifesto. And that was an attempt to use the language of Occupy Wall Street to say that, liberal feminism is a feminism of the 1%. We need this different feminism. And now I guess there's sort of a struggle around that issue.
Okay, I would like to discuss that much longer, but we have to talk about the pandemic, which is our main subject, and time is running already. So I read this chapter that you wrote. You told me it's sort of the afterword of your coming book, and when we think about the pandemic, and even I in the beginning thought about the pandemic, I thought of it as some kind of natural catastrophe that breaks into humanity and sort of it's something unforeseen, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything humans made. It's just an event, an unexplainable event. And after I read your text, I see it a little bit different. Maybe you can explain your side of this pandemic.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is, you're right. It's a brief afterword to the new book. Most of that book was written before the outbreak of COVID, but the title of this little afterword is A Perfect Storm of Capitalist Irrationality and Injustice. And I see the pandemic as the point where all of these irrationalities and injustices of capitalism converge, including, as you say, the virus itself. So we know now that, and I probably shared your initial view at the outset, but we've since learned something about where this virus came from. And it has to do with what the epidemiologists call a zoonotic leap to human beings from other species. And the short answer is that the virus was harbored in bats, like bats are great reservoirs of viruses, living in remote caves far from human beings for a very long time. It never caused anybody any trouble. But something happened that brought these bats into contact with a bridging or intermediate species. The bats passed it to them, and then something happened that brought that species into contact with us, and we got the virus through this thing. What brought these new proximities of species that had previously been rather distanced from one another? I think the answers are twofold, namely global warming on the one hand and tropical deforestation on the other. As we know, global warming has been triggering massive migrations of species out of their original habitats, going to climates where they can better survive. And in the meantime, the deforestation, cutting down of rainforest, especially in the tropics, has also promoted these species migrations. And so you get species that are organisms that are distressed and trying to find a new niche, and that are now in contact with other species that they've never had any previous contact with. And by the way, that's the same dynamic that was behind all the other coronavirus outbreaks and other outbreaks. So we got the Nipah virus passed from bats to pigs to humans. We got SARS passed from bats to civets to humans, MERS from bats to camels to humans. Now COVID-19 probably, although the science isn't definitive, via pangolins or some other intermediary species. And this is because of global warming and tropical deforestation. And what lies behind those things? Capitalism, right? The bombardment of the atmosphere by greenhouse gases is a major source of global warming, and the cutting down of rainforest in order to make way for mining and cattle ranching in the Amazon and elsewhere in Asia. This is the other. So these are both the children, so to speak, of capitalism. And COVID-19 is not the last pandemic that we're going to face, because these underlying causes continue. And so, yes, it's natural, but it's not only natural.
Well, the question is how much natural exists anymore anyway. Nothing is nature. Everything is human-made nature, so to speak. And you also in your book you say it's not only the origin, also the response of it is also an appearance of capitalist irrationality. Maybe you could explain that. And I would like to pose a question, though, in defense of capitalism, so to speak, because capitalism also, surprisingly enough, was very quick. Creativity through greed, as Boris Johnson put it, to develop a vaccine. And it becomes very creative through crisis. So isn't that a point for capitalism on the other side?
So yes and no. Okay, let me first say that however bad COVID would have been in any case, it has proved immeasurably worse for us because of other aspects of what's been happening via capitalism. And I mean this neoliberal austerity logic that we've been living through for the last 40 years. We have seen across the board massive disinvestment in public health infrastructure. So the very capacities, the very public capacities that we needed and might have used in order to mitigate the pandemic, in order to save lives, to get it under control more quickly, had been already depleted by this austerity imposed disinvestment in public healthcare infrastructure. We think too much of healthcare in terms of individual treatment, what my doctor can do for me, what medicine, but there's a whole infrastructural side to this. And the pandemic has shed a light on that and shown how important it is to maintain that, just as we have to maintain roads and bridges and physical infrastructure. Now, related to the disinvestment in public infrastructure, this is a period in which there's been a devolution of public of health care capacity to the private sector. Private firms now control the lion's share of the world's capacities to deal with things like a pandemic. They control the lion's share of healthcare-related labor forces, the development of pharmaceuticals, the supply, manufacturing capacities, supply chains, research capacities, and these are in the hands now largely of private firms whose incentive is not the public interest. What they care about is the bottom line, their share price, and we see this most clearly in the whole struggle right now over intellectual property in the vaccine, whether or not that vaccine can be made available as a public good, as it should and must be if we're ever going to get a hold of this. So this is why I think that the privatization of public healthcare capacity has been a huge handicap. And now I come to your defense of capitalism. Well, I have to say that a great deal of vaccine development was prepared from the public health sector, from the Institutes of Health and the Center for Disease Control. I only know of the United States institutes, and perhaps there are others, but this whole technology of messenger RNA, it's like the internet. The Defense Department invented the internet. It was started out as a public good. Then, of course, it got taken over by Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple and so on. It's the same. A great deal of this technology was originally developed in the public sector, but in a different climate. We got the Moderna vaccine is a partnership with the CDC. Pfizer was a private one. So anyway, it's not clear that capitalism deserves the credit. I would say science deserves the credit. And science can develop just as well through public support, and indeed it often has.
I think there's a question from the audience or two. Maybe we can take some time, Karsten, to pose them in between, and we come back to the question of public health and pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I use this opportunity to encourage more questions from the audience, but we have one which goes back to the discussion on feminism. And the question is, what does Nancy Fraser think to be the core of feminism? In light of the recent French ban on a particular type of minority females' clothing and its wider support by feminists, what does the future of feminism hold in respect to egalitarianism? That is the question we have so far.
Well, that's a really great question, and I thank the person who posed it. I would say, first of all, for me, I offer a very broad and very thin definition of feminism. To me, it only means the idea that there exist gender inequalities, asymmetries, injustices in society, that these things are wrong, that they should be changed, and that they can be changed, that there's no reason in principle why we can't get rid of them. Now, I say that's broad and thin because it leaves wide open what the best way to understand these asymmetries, injustices, and inequalities are, how to understand their causes, what it would take to actually eliminate or overcome them. So for me, feminism is a field of argument about those questions. And I have my own position within that field of argument. So if I had to give myself a name, it would be I'm a democratic eco-socialist feminist, okay? But there is liberal feminism, there is anti-colonial feminism, there are many, right, alternative feminisms. And the one that the questioner mentioned is a kind of, I would say, well, it presents itself as a laïcisme in the French sense of being, separating religion from the state and so on, in that old Republican tradition. But I would say it's a crypto-majoritarian communitarianism, meaning that it is sort of universalizing this French Republican laicist idea of what the community standards are. And it's universalizing that in a context that is actually multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, in which there are alternative community standards. So there's something already problematic to me about these bans on the hijab and headscarves and so on. I don't deny that the French feminists who support the ban are feminists, but I think they're the wrong kind of feminists. And I think that we need a feminism that is more capacious and that and more sophisticated. So, for example, I would say that the headscarf is not today, and maybe it was in the past, but is not today an unequivocal signifier of patriarchy. I would say that it is in part, at least, a badge of resistance to the anti-Muslim majoritarian sentiment in France. It's a sort of badge of pride. It means different things. It's not just patriarchal. There may be reactionary currents in the French Muslim population who want it to be a sign of patriarchy and who would treat it that way. But many young women who wear the scarf or who wear the hijab mean something else by it. And it's a mistake to sort of grab onto one meaning of this. This is also, if there's a contestation, an argument within feminism over what that is, there is also a contestation, an argument within Islam over whether that can accommodate feminism and gender egalitarianism or not. And we need to be more open to all of that. So that's my view about it.
Okay, that's very interesting, because it touches on a subject that I wanted to come back in the context of Corona again, namely symbolical meanings in public. You made the point for science and for being and for public science, not science in the interest of capital and profit, but funded by the state and presumably neutral in its purposes. But the state has a problem, as like the hijab, the state is a victim of neoliberalization, and nobody likes the state. Like take China's success with the virus, only less than 100,000 infections because of authoritarian measures. Nobody likes these measures. Nobody believes the 100,000 really, but apparently they were successful, and democratic states who could isolate themselves and be stronger in their measures, Australia and New Zealand, were successful too. But still, the state has, especially among even left liberal communities, a very bad image. And in Europe, there are tendencies to overemphasize, for example, the danger for civil liberties rather over measures for public health of most people. I don't know if there are tendencies like this in the US, probably not, but I don't know. But the image of the state is a big problem in this context, I think.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think, if anything, this problem is even worse in the United States. I mean, we have the people who invaded the US Capitol building on January 6th, hoping to prevent or delay the certification of Joe Biden's victory in the presidential election, have a whole theory, and this was encouraged by Trump, about the deep state, they call it, which is, sort of got all these nefarious plans and conspiracies and so on and so forth. We have a very strong anti-vax movement, people who believe that the vaccine is a conspiracy. They deny the reality of the COVID pandemic. It's like climate denialism. It's all a hoax. We have people who believe that masks give you cancer and that you should not wear masks. And that's an attempt on the part of the deep state. So, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of insanity in our culture that grows out of these strong libertarian traditions that are very suspicious of the state in general, but have now been, let's say, exacerbated to this fever pitch by the Trumpist, whole right-wing populist ecosystem, so to speak. And I believe that in this context, I have plenty of objections to what states, and above all, the US state has done. For example, invading Iraq and many other horrible things, fomenting coup d'etats all around the world, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to public health, unfortunately, the WHO is weak and may not have done its job in the best possible way. In any case, when you're in a health emergency, as we are, then we have to rely on the existing public powers, and I think that the countries that did best, and I would include China, are those that even when there are authoritarian tendencies, where the population basically accepts the necessity of public power. They may want a more democratic public power, but they're not lunatic libertarian individualists. They have a culture that accepts the public power. So I will tell you right now that I am in favor, in the United States at least, of so-called vaccine passports. We've vaccinated about 100 million people and are having trouble now getting there is vaccine resistance and vaccine hesitancy. Many people now are refusing to get vaccinated. Under these circumstances, I am in favor of introducing vaccine passports, which would say, you want to go to a baseball game, you need to show proof that you've been vaccinated. You want to go to a theater. Now, that's perhaps an infringement of individual liberty, you can say, but there are circumstances in which you need to, create the right incentives. Whoops, I have something else.
Here was the discussion was more about curfews and so forth, but I think we still have some more questions from the audience, and I don't want to talk too much, which I always do. So, Karsten, please.
We all enjoy it. So we have a series of questions, and I post them maybe all, and you have to pick and choose a set of questions on US politics. Do you see the Biden administration represent a solution to the hegemony gap through the co-optation of progressive populism's agenda? And related, maybe, what do you think about the recent developments in the US about the vaccine patents? Are the responses optimistic, or can that really make a difference? That would be a set of questions on the United States. And if you allow, I also ask questions on geopolitics. So what role do you see for geopolitics, so the struggle among nation states within the capitalist social order of today? And to this, I would add, so which difference will it make for the future of capitalism or its alternatives, whether the US or China dominates in 20 years from now? Last question, and all of them will take us a long time, but we can really go a bit longer than what we scheduled. We are all captivated, I think. The last question is, the right to health should be no longer considered as a pure or mere rhetoric, not enforceable right, but should have its normal place in the catalog of human rights. Do you agree with it?
Okay, those are all great questions. Thanks to those who posed them. I'm going to take them in the order in which Karsten read them, and I see the Biden administration is extremely interesting. He has surprised everyone, certainly me, by posing himself as what we call a transformational president, someone who doesn't just sort of come in and continue try to improve this or that, but is really introducing a certain break. That's the appearance anyway. No one, I think, expected that from him. And you're right that the various relief bills, the infrastructure bill, the family bill, the COVID relief, all this legislative activity involves really a great deal of the Sanders agenda, of the left wing of the Democratic Party, which we thought had lost in the primary to Biden. It now is, in a sense, dictating the Biden agenda. That's at least the appearance. Now, what I want to say is that this is a very uneasy and fragile compromise formation. The centrist wing, the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party didn't really have any bold ideas that could address this situation. They had to borrow them from the left wing, but I don't believe that this alliance between the centrist wing and the left wing of the Democratic Party can persist that long. I don't, I believe that the contradictions are going to be appearing, the cracks will appear. I don't see how the Biden orientation as it's developed so far can satisfy at one and the same time the powerful investor class, the donor class, on the one hand, the suburban voters who defected from the Republican Party out of revulsion from Trump's, crudity and craziness, how it can keep them in, how it can keep the Sanders AOC voters in, how it can keep even though those fractions of the white working class who had in 2016 defected to Trump, some of them now came back in those northern Rust Belt states to vote for Biden. So I think we're still in what Antonio Gramsci would call an interregnum, one of these in-between periods between hegemonies, that neoliberalism has lost its glow, its hegemony, even if it still has its fingers on the levers of power. And we don't yet see the outlines of what exactly will replace it. In between, the Gramsci quote continues, "The old is dying, the new cannot be born." In between are all the morbid symptoms. So I think we're still in that area, and it's anybody's guess how this will play out. And a lot of it, of course, depends on what we do, what kinds of interventions we make into a chaotic and confused situation where there is a struggle, and it will be an ongoing struggle to build a counter hegemony, a new project, whether it's a new form of capitalism or a post-capitalism or some kind of horrendous regressive authoritarianism, that remains to be seen. So that's my thought about that. On the vaccine patents, and maybe I can connect that up to the last question about health as a human right. And I strongly agree with the questioner who asked about that, and with Bernie Sanders, who has reiterated again and again and again that healthcare is a human right, not a privilege that you have to pay for. I strongly agree with that, and I think that view entails that corporations cannot and should not be allowed to own the means that we need for global public health. That intellectual property in absolutely urgent, life-saving vaccines or pharmaceutical treatments is completely illegitimate. And but I think to say that represents a real assault on the citadel of corporate power. And I don't think it's going to be an easy fight. I think they're going to fight tooth and nail to retain their intellectual property in that and other forms of property that are inimical to humanity as a whole. Then the last point about the geopolitics. I guess that what I would say is that, well, I'll go out on a limb. To me, it seems clear that in 20 or 30 years, if there is one dominant power as opposed to some kind of a multipolar order, it won't be the United States, it will be China, both because of its economic might, which it's a rising power. The United States is a declining power. We are declining in terms of economic might. And I would say that we have lost let's say, the moral credibility and moral authority that we had, which is another prop of hegemonic geopolitical power. The only thing we've got going for us, and I don't think it's enough, is military. There are, three legs of geopolitical hegemony: economic power, military might, moral credibility, the ability to present yourself to the world as standing for the larger global interest and not your own national interest. The United States no longer has that. So I suspect if there is one dominant hegemonic power, it will be China. China's, engaged in this sort of public relations offensive, including vaccine diplomacy, including the whole Belt and Road Initiative. It's articulating a vision which it claims is not simply a national Chinese vision, but one that can be globally hegemonic. Like every hegemonic vision, that's partly a trick, a sleight of hand, because the national interest is very strong. But we'll see. And, what difference it makes, I would say, is that it means that the fight for a democratic order and the fight for let's call it a human rights order that's broad, that's not just the civil rights, but also like social rights, like public health and so on. The fight for all of that will have to take a different shape when the leading power is China than when it is the United States, precisely because the Chinese, have this dirigiste system. They depend more heavily on the competency and of public power, its ability to manage an economy as well as a public health emergency. So it's not going to involve this image of that America tries to project of democracy. It's going to have other strengths and other weaknesses. It will be a different fight.
Okay, so I think time is becoming a problem for us, I'm afraid. But there's one question in connection with that I would like to pose. Because in hegemonial questions, there's always a question of public and public communication too. And manufacturing consent is one thing, and that's being done all the time. And it's being done in ways that are taking place in a market that's also neoliberal and neoliberalized by Clinton, by the way, in the communications market and your social media firms and so forth, and they try to escape democratic and public control completely. So my question is, in this situation of uncontrolled and anti-state and anti-public communication, so to speak, with new social media, which are a worldwide force, consider Facebook and so forth, how do you, as opposed to manufacturing consent, how do you manufacture discontent or non-consent?
Well, that's a great question, and I think actually we don't manufacture it. I think that capitalism is manufacturing its own discontent. As I said, we're in a moment of genuine, I think, general crisis of the social order. COVID is one aspect of this, and there are many others. So the rise, for example, of these right-wing, chauvinistic, exclusionary populisms is an expression of discontent just as much as the forms of left-wing populism or Sanders-like movements are a sign of more of a better form of discontent, a more rational and promising and emancipatory form of discontent. So the discontent is there, but you're right, it is interwoven with all sorts of processes that we're only beginning to understand. of the influencers in social media, all the ways in which a certain kind of consumerist lifestyle is still validated, and even in the midst of what looks to be wide defection from the neoliberal orthodoxy. So it's a complicated situation, but I start with the idea that we or I as an intellectual with activist leanings, let's say, I don't manufacture anything except some theory. And my hope is that in manufacturing the kind of theory I manufacture, it sheds some light for people who are already in motion for their own reasons, in their own situation, facing their own impasses, which are, take different forms in different places for different populations. People are in motion, are discontent, want some kind of change, are experimenting with different ideas about what kind of change, of how to make change. And what I've tried to do in my recent work in this book, in writing about COVID as a perfect storm of capitalist irrationality and justice, I'm trying to suggest that many of the problems that are causing discontent and engagement, for better or for worse, can all be traced back to one and the same thing, and that is the design of capitalism as a social formation that is inherently primed to cannibalize nature, to feed off of care work and deplete our energies for doing that, to feed off of and hollow out the public powers we need to solve our problems, to scarf up the wealth and labor of racialized populations. These are all things that capitalism does non-accidentally. And so my idea is to say, hey, your discontent, look at where your discontent fits on a larger map in relation to other discontents that other people are experiencing. Let's realize there's a single source, a single common enemy. Let's unite and fight.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy Fraser, for these words of hope. And I think we're a little bit over time, but I'm certain we haven't taken your patience over what we should have done. And I thank you very much for your insights and for taking part in this conversation. It was very, very interesting. And I just wanted to say that everybody who will read your book will find, of course, much, much more than we could just touch on now. And it's a very concise analytic, and that's always the beginning of change. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you, Armin, for being such an engaging and interesting conversation partner. It's really been a pleasure to be in dialogue with you. And thanks to the audience questions, which were also extremely stimulating.
I extend my thanks on behalf of the many people who have been watching. I feel a little bit like the owner of a dance club who now, because there's curfew approaching, tells people to leave. But I'm sure we could have gone on for much more time. I would have liked to. But I sincerely also hope that the conversation on Nancy Fraser's stimulating ideas will continue in many different corners of society. And given the situation we're in, I also hope that not only conversations, but also some concrete actions will follow before too late. So if you want to watch this conversation again, I want to announce this to the audience. There will be versions of it, or one version, hopefully only, on the International Karl Polanyi Society and on CU's website. And beyond this, I wish you all a pleasant day, or evening or morning, depending on where on planet Earth you have been following this event. So see you soon.